So let's start. In 1985, aboard the Space Shuttle Discovery, astronaut Charles Walker experienced something that left him shaken for the rest of the mission. Everyone else was asleep. The lights were dimmed. The shuttle floated in absolute silence through the void 350 kilometers above Earth. Walker was alone on watch, staring out the window at the endless blackness when he saw it. A shape, human-like, moving outside the spacecraft. He didn't move. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. And the shape was still there, floating in the darkness. No suit, no tether, no logical explanation. Walker froze for a few seconds, his mind racing through every possible rational answer. Debris? A reflection? His own face bouncing back from the glass? He'd been in space long enough to know what a reflection looked like. He said this wasn't one. The figure seemed to drift, almost deliberately, before vanishing into the black. NASA's official explanation. Trick of light and shadow, fatigue, the human brain trying to make sense of patterns in the darkness. But that didn't stop people from pointing out that Walker wasn't the only astronaut to report something like this. He wasn't even close to the first, and he wouldn't be the last. Space is supposed to be empty. That's the whole point. A vacuum. Nothing but radiation, dust, and the occasional rock hurtling through the void. Yet astronauts keep seeing things, hearing things, experiencing things that don't fit into the clean scientific narratives we're comfortable with. These aren't conspiracy theorists or attention seekers. These are trained pilots, engineers, scientists, people who've dedicated their lives to precision and rationality. And yet, when they come back from the edge of our atmosphere, some of them bring stories that give people chills. Here's where it gets weird. In December 1972, during Apollo 17, the last crewed mission to the Moon, astronauts Eugene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt heard something strange while orbiting the lunar surface. Music, not the kind you'd expect from equipment malfunction or radio interference. Actual music, melodic, rhythmic, almost otherworldly. They described it as a weird, space-type music. The sound lasted for nearly an hour as they passed over the far side of the Moon, completely cut off from Earth's radio signals. When they mentioned it in the debriefing, NASA seemed unconcerned. Background noise, they said. Interference between the lunar module and the command module radios. Except the music didn't sound like static or feedback. It sounded organized. Intentional. Cernan and Schmitt weren't the first to hear it either. The crew of Apollo 10 had reported the exact same phenomenon 3 years earlier. They'd even debated whether to report it, worried people might think they were losing their minds. They called it the space choir. If space really does sing, it might not be a metaphor. The thing about space is that it messes with your senses. There's no up or down, no day or night in the way we understand it. Your body doesn't know how to process the environment, so your brain starts filling in gaps. Sometimes those gaps get filled with things that shouldn't be there. Astronauts on the International Space Station have reported hearing knocking sounds on the hull, not random banging from debris impacts or thermal expansion, rhythmic knocking, tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. Like someone or something is trying to get in. Yang Liwei, China's first astronaut, described hearing a knocking during his 2003 mission aboard Shenzhou 5. He said it sounded like someone knocking on the body of the spaceship, just as if knocking an iron bucket with a wooden hammer. He checked every system, looked for loose equipment, found nothing. When he returned to Earth, he tried to recreate the sound for technicians, hoping they could identify the source. They couldn't. To this day, Chinese astronauts are briefed about the knocking before their missions, told it's normal, told not to worry. But nobody has ever explained what causes it. What makes this even stranger is the pattern. These aren't isolated incidents scattered across decades. They cluster. Multiple astronauts on the same mission reporting the same phenomena. Different crews on different spacecraft experiencing identical anomalies. In 1998, during a spacewalk outside Mir, cosmonaut Gennady Padalka saw lights approaching the station. Not satellites, not meteors. Lights that seemed to move with purpose, changing direction, pulsing in intensity. He reported it immediately. Mission Control had no explanation. No satellites were scheduled to pass nearby. No known objects were in the vicinity. The lights eventually faded, and Padalka went back to work. But the incident was logged, documented, never explained. Years later, other astronauts would see similar lights during their own missions. Some bright and distant, others uncomfortably close. Here's the thing. Space agencies don't like mysteries. Everything is supposed to have an explanation. Every anomaly gets investigated, categorized, filed away with a neat little label. But some things slip through the cracks. Some observations don't fit into existing frameworks. And when that happens, the official response is usually the same. Atmospheric phenomenon, equipment malfunction, human error, optical illusion. Pick one, file it, move on. Except the astronauts themselves often push back. They know what equipment malfunction looks like. They know what fatigue feels like. They know the difference between seeing something and imagining something. And some of them remain convinced that what they experienced was real, even if they can't explain it. The worst part is the silence after. Astronauts come back from space changed, not just physically. They talk about the overview effect, the profound shift in perspective that comes from seeing Earth as a fragile blue marble floating in the void. But some of them also come back with questions they can't answer, things they saw that don't make sense. And when they try to talk about it, they're met with skepticism or worse, official discouragement. Mentioning unexplained phenomena can damage credibility. It can hurt funding. It can make you look unstable. So most astronauts learn to keep quiet. They mention it once in a debriefing, maybe in a memoir years later, then let it fade into the background. But the questions linger. The memories don't go away. And every new mission brings the possibility of encountering something else that refuses to be explained. One of the strangest cases involves Buzz Aldrin and the Apollo 11 crew. On their way to the moon in 1969, they saw something following them, an object, cylindrical, tumbling slowly. It wasn't the lunar module, which was docked with the command module. It wasn't a piece of their own spacecraft. It kept pace with them for hours, maintaining a consistent distance, visible through the windows. The crew discussed it privately, careful not to broadcast their observations over open channels. When they finally mentioned it to Mission Control, the response was measured. Probably a panel from the Saturn V rocket's separation, they said. Except the crew wasn't convinced. The object didn't behave like debris, it moved too deliberately. And when they tried to photograph it, the images came back unclear, grainy, inconclusive. Decades later, Aldrin would downplay the incident in interviews, offering the debris explanation himself. But the initial uncertainty, the careful wording, the private discussions, all of it suggests they weren't sure what they were looking at. And that hesitation, that moment of not knowing, is what makes the story stick. The Apollo 11 object wasn't unique. That's the unsettling part. When you start digging through mission transcripts, debriefing notes, and off-the-record interviews, you realize that nearly every long-duration spaceflight has at least one incident that doesn't add up. Objects that shouldn't be there. Sounds that have no source. Experiences that challenge everything we think we know about what exists beyond our atmosphere. And the more time astronauts spend in space, the more likely they are to encounter something that defies explanation. It's almost as if space itself is testing them, presenting mysteries just beyond the edge of understanding. In 2003, during Expedition 7 aboard the International Space Station, astronaut Ed Lu reported hearing something that made his blood run cold. Breathing. Not his own, not his crewmates, someone else's. Slow, rhythmic breathing coming from somewhere inside the station. He was alone in the Zvezda module, conducting routine maintenance when he heard it. At first, he thought it was the life support system, air cycling through vents, pumps regulating pressure, normal mechanical sounds that the brain sometimes interprets as familiar patterns. But this was different. This sounded organic, human. He stopped working, held his breath, listened, and the breathing continued. When he moved toward the sound, it seemed to shift, coming from a different direction. When he called out to his crewmate, asking if he was nearby, the response came from the opposite end of the station. The breathing stopped. Lu searched every module, checked every system, found nothing. The incident was logged but never explained. Some suggested auditory hallucination brought on by isolation and stress. Others pointed to the station's complex acoustic environment, where sounds can travel in unexpected ways through metal and air. But Liu himself remained uncertain. He knew what he heard, and it didn't sound like machinery. What people don't realize is how utterly alien the environment of space actually feels. Every sense is disoriented. Vision warps without a horizon. Smell intensifies in the recycled air. And hearing becomes unreliable when there's no atmosphere to carry sound the way our brains expect. Astronauts report that silence in space isn't really silent. It's filled with vibrations, hums, clicks, and tones that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The human brain, evolved for Earth's sensory landscape, struggles to process this flood of unfamiliar input. Sometimes it compensates by creating patterns, faces in shadows, music in static, breathing in mechanical noise, but sometimes astronauts insist the patterns are too organized to be random, too consistent to be imagination. And when multiple people hear the same thing at the same time, in the same place, the hallucination theory starts to break down. Here's the kicker. In 1962, during the Mercury Atlas 6 mission, John Glenn became the first American to orbit Earth. It was a triumph of engineering and courage, but it also gave Glenn an experience that puzzled him for the rest of his life. As he passed over the Pacific with the sun rising behind him, he saw them. Thousands of tiny, luminous particles swirling around his capsule. He called them fireflies. They weren't debris. They didn't behave like ice crystals or paint flakes. They seemed to dance, drifting in patterns that defied orbital mechanics. Glenn tapped on the capsule wall and the particles reacted, swirling more intensely. When he reported the phenomenon to Mission Control, there was silence, then cautious acknowledgement. Other astronauts on subsequent Mercury missions saw the same fireflies. Scott Carpenter, Wally Schirra. All of them tried to capture the particles, study them, understand them. The official explanation eventually settled on frozen condensation from the spacecraft's water vents, illuminated by sunlight. Except the particles moved in ways that frozen water shouldn't. They responded to vibrations. They appeared at times when no venting was occurring. And they seemed, in Glenn's words, almost alive. To put it in perspective, Glenn was a decorated pilot, a senator, a man not prone to flights of fancy. If he said something seemed alive, that word choice matters. The creepy part is when you realize how many visual anomalies astronauts have witnessed that never made headlines. Flashes of light behind closed eyelids, caused by cosmic rays passing through their optic nerves. Fair enough, that's understood. But what about the structured lights, the geometric patterns that appear in the darkness outside spacecraft windows? In 1973, during the Skylab 4 mission, astronaut Edward Gibson saw a red glowing object moving parallel to the station. It wasn't a satellite. It wasn't a meteor. It maintained a consistent distance for several minutes before accelerating away at a speed that should have been impossible for any known technology. Gibson reported it immediately. Mission Control checked all known objects in orbit. None matched the description. The object was never identified. Years later, during an interview, Gibson was asked if he believed it was extraterrestrial. He paused, then said he believed it was real, whatever it was. That careful distinction, real but unexplained, shows up again and again in astronaut testimonies. But it's not just what astronauts see and hear, it's what they feel. Cosmonauts aboard Salyut 7 in 1985 reported a presence. Not a person, not a physical entity. A presence. They described feeling watched. Several crew members at different times reported seeing orange, cloud-like forms outside the station. Forms that seemed to shift and pulse. Forms that gave them an overwhelming sense of being observed. When they looked directly at the forms, the shapes would change, becoming more defined, almost resembling massive humanoid figures surrounded by glowing mist. The crew was experienced, rational, not prone to panic, but the sightings were so consistent, so detailed, that Soviet officials took them seriously. Medical evaluations found nothing wrong. Psychological assessments came back normal. The incident was classified, buried in reports, and never publicly addressed until decades later when former cosmonauts began speaking more openly. What makes it so interesting is that the crew described the same phenomenon, not similar. The same colors, same shapes, same overwhelming feeling of being watched by something immense. Here's what makes it stranger. These experiences often coincide with moments of extreme isolation or physical stress. Spacewalks, where astronauts are separated from their spacecraft by nothing but a thin suit. Long-duration missions, where weeks bleed into months of floating in a tin can. High-radiation environments, where cosmic particles bombard every cell. Some researchers have suggested that the human brain, pushed to its limits in these extreme conditions, might become more sensitive to phenomena we normally filter out. Quantum fluctuations, electromagnetic fields, dimensions of reality that exist but remain imperceptible under normal circumstances. It sounds like science fiction, but when veteran astronauts, people with impeccable credentials and nothing to gain from lying, consistently report experiences that defy conventional explanation, maybe it's worth considering that space reveals things we're not ready to understand. The scariest stories are the ones that never got official recognition. Whispered conversations between astronauts. Off-the-record admissions years after retirement. In 1991, during a classified military mission aboard the Shuttle Discovery, the crew allegedly saw something that resulted in an immediate communication blackout. For 11 minutes, all transmissions between the shuttle and ground control ceased. When communication resumed, the crew was told to maintain radio silence about what they'd observed. Decades later, one crew member, speaking on condition of anonymity, described seeing a massive dark object passing between the shuttle and Earth, an object that blocked out stars, an object that moved with purpose. When asked why he didn't come forward publicly, he said simply that some things are above his pay grade. Some things, once seen, are better left unspoken, because in space, when something stares back at you, there's nowhere to run. The most disturbing cases are the ones that suggest space isn't as empty as we think, that consciousness, presence, maybe even intelligence exists in forms we haven't conceptualized yet, and that astronauts, by virtue of leaving Earth's protective embrace, become witnesses to realities the rest of us never encounter. These aren't stories shared casually, they're confessions, admissions that come after years of silence, when the weight of keeping quiet becomes heavier than the fear of not being believed. And when you listen to enough of these accounts, a pattern emerges. Space changes people, not just their bodies or their perspectives. Something deeper, something that suggests our understanding of reality might be fundamentally incomplete. In 1997, cosmonaut Sergei Avdeyev returned from the Mir space station after 379 days in orbit. That's more than a year floating in microgravity, watching Earth spin below, experiencing sunrise and sunset 16 times a day. During debriefing, he mentioned something that Soviet officials initially dismissed as fatigue-induced confusion. Voices. He'd heard voices speaking Russian in empty modules, not through the radio, not from his crewmates, voices coming from the walls. At first he thought it was his imagination, the brain creating company in isolation, but the voices were consistent. They spoke in clear sentences. They seemed to respond to his movements. When he entered a module, the voices would stop. When he left, they would resume, faint but distinct, like whispered conversations just beyond the edge of comprehension. Other cosmonauts who'd spent extended time on Mir admitted they'd heard similar things, but never reported them, fearing psychiatric evaluation or mission termination. One cosmonaut, speaking anonymously years later, said the voices seemed to come from the station itself, as if Mir had developed some kind of awareness after years of human habitation, as if the metal and circuits and recycled air had absorbed something from the people who lived within it. The explanation offered was auditory hallucination caused by isolation, sensory deprivation, and the constant hum of machinery. Except these weren't vague sounds, these were words, sentences, conversations that multiple people heard independently. What people don't talk about is the photographic evidence that allegedly exists but has never been publicly released. In 1991, astronaut Story Musgrave, during a spacewalk to repair the Hubble Space Telescope, took a series of photographs documenting the repair process. Standard procedure, routine documentation. Except when the film was developed, one image showed something that shouldn't have been there. An object, large, cylindrical, positioned between the shuttle and Earth, perfectly framed in the background of a shot focused on Hubble's solar array. Musgrave insisted he didn't see the object during the spacewalk. The photographic team examined the negative. No evidence of tampering, no lens flare, no processing error. The object was there, captured on film, undeniable. NASA classified the image. It was never included in the mission's official photographic record. Musgrave, when asked about it years later in an interview, became visibly uncomfortable. He acknowledged that unusual things appeared in photos sometimes. He acknowledged that not everything makes it into the public archive. Then he changed the subject. Researchers who've tried to access the classified image through Freedom of Information requests have been denied. The official reason cited is national security. What national security issue could possibly relate to an object photographed near a scientific satellite? The silence speaks louder than any explanation could. Here's where it gets truly unsettling. Multiple astronauts have reported experiencing time distortion during their missions, not the relativistic time dilation predicted by physics, which at orbital velocities amounts to fractions of a second. We're talking about subjective experiences of time stretching or compressing in ways that can't be explained by known physics. During Apollo 14 in 1971, astronaut Edgar Mitchell described a moment during the return flight when time seemed to stop. He was looking out the window at Earth and suddenly everything froze. The movement of the spacecraft, the rotation of the planet, his own thoughts. He said it felt like existing in a single eternal moment where past, present and future collapsed into one point of awareness. The experience lasted, by the spacecraft's chronometer, less than a second, but Mitchell described it as subjective hours, an infinity compressed into an instant. When he tried to explain it to ground control, he struggled to find words. When he mentioned it in his autobiography decades later, he described it as a glimpse beyond the veil of normal perception. A moment when the universe revealed itself in a way human consciousness isn't designed to process. Mitchell wasn't alone. Other astronauts have described similar experiences, usually in private conversations, rarely in official records, moments when time behaves differently, moments when the rigid structure of sequential reality seems to dissolve. The really scary part isn't what astronauts see or hear. It's what happens when they try to share their experiences and encounter institutional resistance. In 2008, during Expedition 17 aboard the ISS, astronaut Garrett Reisman saw something during a spacewalk that he immediately reported to Mission Control. The transmission was brief, terse, then radio silence for 40 seconds. When communication resumed, Mission Control instructed Reisman to continue his work and discuss the observation during the private medical conference scheduled for later. Those private medical conferences are encrypted communications where astronauts can discuss health issues without public broadcast. What Reisman discussed in that conference has never been disclosed, but colleagues noted that he seemed shaken when he returned inside the station, and in the years since his retirement, he's consistently deflected questions about unusual sightings, referring all inquiries to NASA's official channels, which provide no information. The pattern repeats across agencies and decades. Astronauts see something, they report it. The report disappears into classified archives, and the astronauts are discouraged, sometimes explicitly, sometimes subtly, from discussing the matter publicly. To put it in perspective, NASA and other space agencies have protocols for almost everything. Medical emergencies, equipment failures, orbital debris impacts, even first contact scenarios, should humanity encounter definitive evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence. But there's no public protocol for unexplained phenomena that don't fit existing categories. No standardized reporting procedure, no declassified database of anomalies. What does exist are internal classification systems, non-disclosure agreements, and a culture that treats unexplained observations as potential threats to mission credibility and funding security. When astronauts break that silence, they do so carefully years after retirement, often couching their statements in ambiguous language that provides plausible deniability. They talk about unusual experiences, unexplained phenomena, things they can't categorize, but they rarely use words like alien or supernatural because those words carry consequences. Career damage, public ridicule, dismissal as unstable or attention-seeking, So most choose silence. They carry their experiences privately. They share them only with others who've been to space and might understand. And the official record remains sanitized, incomplete, a carefully curated version of reality that excludes anything too strange to explain. What this means is that our understanding of what exists beyond Earth's atmosphere is almost certainly incomplete. Not because we lack the technology to observe. We've sent probes to the edge of the solar system. We've photographed distant galaxies. We've detected gravitational waves from black holes billions of light years away. But we've systematically ignored or suppressed observations made by trained professionals in extreme environments who report phenomena that challenge our comfortable materialist worldview. Maybe those phenomena are all explainable. Maybe there are rational scientific answers we haven't discovered yet. Or maybe space is revealing something fundamental about reality that we're not ready to accept. That consciousness extends beyond biological brains. That dimensions exist we can't perceive from Earth's surface. That the universe is stranger, more alive, more aware than our current models allow. The astronauts who've seen things they can't explain, who've heard voices in empty modules and watched lights move with impossible purpose, they didn't ask for these experiences. They didn't seek them out. They were simply doing their jobs, pushing the boundaries of human exploration, and in doing so, they encountered the edge of the known, and what waits at that edge refuses to be neatly categorized or easily dismissed. Maybe the knocking sounds are just thermal expansion. Maybe the voices are auditory hallucinations. Maybe the objects are debris, and the lights are satellites, and the presences are tricks of exhausted minds desperate for stimulation. Or maybe, just maybe, astronauts are telling the truth. Maybe they're witnessing realities that exist but remain hidden from those of us who never leave the planet. Maybe space is full of mysteries we're only beginning to glimpse, and the silence surrounding these phenomena says more about our fear of the unknown than it does about the validity of the observations. Because when you've dedicated your life to exploration, when you've risked everything to venture beyond Earth's protective atmosphere, and you come back with stories that make people uncomfortable, that challenge fundamental assumptions about what's possible, maybe the least we can do is listen, not dismiss, not explain away. Just listen, and consider the possibility that the universe is far stranger than we've allowed ourselves to believe. The astronauts who've been there, who floated in the void and looked back at our fragile world, they know something the rest of us don't. And their silence, their careful words, their reluctant admissions, they all point to the same unsettling truth. Space is not empty. It's watching. It's waiting. And one day, we might finally be ready to acknowledge what's been there all along.